The light in the high peak did not so much fade as withdraw, a shy guest retreating from a room that had grown too cold for conversation. Elias Thorne sat on the weathered oak bench of his porch, his back pressed against the stone wall of the cottager structure that had stood for 200 years and intended, by all accounts, to outlast him by 200 more. The air in Derbyshire during late October carried a sharp, metallic tang, the scent of bruised heather and damp limestone. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin, but seemed to inquire after the marrow of one's bones. Elias adjusted the woolen blanket over his knees, his movements slow and deliberate, choreographed by the stiffness of 74 years. In his hands, he held a ceramic mug, the tea inside long since gone cold, a stagnant pool reflecting the darkening sky. He did not mind the cold tea. He was not there for the warmth. He was there for the vigil. He had always found a strange, skeletal beauty in the way the valley surrendered to the night. Below his vantage point, the village of Oakhaven began to prick the gloaming with amber light, small, defiant flickers against the encroaching vastness of the moors. To anyone else, it was merely a Tuesday evening, the mundane transition from toil to rest. But to Elias, every hour spent under this porch was a layer of a much larger, more intricate map he had been drawing in his mind for decades. He thought of the stars not as distant celestial bodies, but as pinpricks in a heavy velvet curtain through which a blinding, impossible light attempted to leak. Martha had used that metaphor once, years ago, when they were young and the world felt like a book they were only just beginning to write. Now, the book was mostly finished, the spine cracked, the ink fading on the earlier chapters. Wait for the one that hums, Eli. She had told him on a night much like this, though perhaps the air had been softer then. The stars don't just fall, they sing on their way down. You just have to be quiet enough to hear the note. He was quiet now. He was a master of silence. Since Martha had passed 3 years ago, silence had become his primary companion, a living thing that sat in the empty chairs and slept in the hollows of the pillows. It wasn't a cruel silence, not anymore. It was more of a mutual understanding. He didn't ask anything of the world, and the world, in turn, allowed him his shadows. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the silhouette of Mamtor rose like a slumbering giant. He found himself wondering about the physics of longing. If a heart grew heavy enough with the weight of someone's absence, did it eventually develop its own gravitational pull? Did it draw the things it missed toward it? Or did it simply sink deeper into the earth? He felt very heavy tonight, not with sadness, precisely, but with a profound sense of anticipation that felt like an ache. He was waiting for a Poseid, or perhaps just a stray piece of cosmic debris, something to streak across the sky and validate the hours he spent shivering in the dark. It was a superstition he had cultivated in his grief that, if he could just witness one perfect full, one brilliant, brief arc of light, it would be a signal, a message from the ether that the energy of a soul didn't simply vanish, but was redistributed into the brilliance of the firmament. A fox barked somewhere in the distance, a raw, lonely sound that echoed off the gritstone edges. Elias shifted his weight. His hip joint gave a dull throb, a reminder of a fall he'd taken near the stream in August. The body, he reflected, was a treacherous vessel. It spent the first half of life expanding, reaching, demanding space, and the second half slowly reclaiming itself, folding inward until one became a mere smudge of what they once were. He looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had worked with wood and clockwork. The creases were stained with years of oil and cedar dust, the skin as translucent as parchment. He remembered how these hands had felt holding his daughter, Clara, when she was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. She was in London now, a world of glass and steel and frantic schedules. She called on Sundays, her voice sounding thin and distracted, as if she were speaking to him from the bottom of a well. "Are you still sitting out there, Dad?" she would ask, a note of gentle exasperation in her tone. "It's freezing in the north. You'll catch your death." He never told her that catching one's death was a redundant phrase. Death was the only thing that caught you, eventually. And besides, the cold was a tether. It reminded him he was still capable of feeling something, even if it was just the bite of the frost. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the darkness behind his eyelids was different from the darkness of the moor. It was a crowded darkness, filled with the ghosts of conversations. He could almost hear the clink of Martha's knitting needles, the rhythmic click-clack that used to be the heartbeat of their living room. He could smell the lavender water she used to favor. These sensory memories were like stars themselves, distant, flickering, and entirely unreachable. When he opened his eyes again, the sky had deepened to a bruised purple, almost black. The first of the constellations were beginning to assert themselves. Orion was rising, the hunter's belt a steady line of silver. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pang of insignificance. In the face of such ancient geometry, what did his little life matter? His grief, his porch, his cold tea, they were less than a heartbeat in the lifespan of a nebula. Yet, this insignificance brought a strange comfort. If his sorrows were small, then they were also manageable. He was part of a grand, indifferent machinery, a tiny cog in a clockwork universe. He watched a satellite drift slowly across the zenith, a steady, unblinking point of light, man-made, predictable. It lacked the wild, erratic soul of a meteor. He wanted the chaos. He wanted the fire. He remembered a night in 1994, a summer of heat waves and parched lawns. He and Martha had dragged a mattress out onto this very porch. They had stayed up until dawn, watching a meteor shower that had felt like the sky was shattering. They hadn't spoken much. There was no need. Every flash of light was a shared thought, a collective intake of breath. That night, he had felt like they were the only two people on the planet, suspended in a capsule of time that the rest of the world couldn't touch. Now, the porch felt cavernous. The wood groaned under the shifting temperature. Elias pulled the blanket tighter. He found himself thinking about the concept of home. People often spoke of it as a place, a set of coordinates, a roof and four walls. But sitting here, he realized home was actually a frequency. It was a specific resonance you shared with another person. When that person left, the frequency didn't disappear, but it became a broadcast with no receiver. You just kept emitting the signal, hoping it might bounce off a moon or a star and return to you in a different form. His thoughts drifted to the clocks in the house behind him. He had dozens of them: mantle clocks, long cases, carriage clocks. He kept them all wound, though he rarely looked at them for the actual time. He liked the sound. The collective ticking was like a steady rain, a reminder that the world was still moving, even when he felt stationary. Sometimes, he imagined the clocks were eating the seconds, devouring the day so he wouldn't have to live through it. A sudden movement in the periphery of his vision made him stiffen. A streak of white-hot light cut through the constellation of Lyra. It was gone in less than a second, a fleeting scratch on the lens of the night. Elias held his breath. His heart, usually a sluggish organ, gave a frantic thump. "Did you see that?" he whispered, the words puffing into a cloud of white vapor in the cold air. There was no answer, of course, only the sigh of the wind through the eaves. But for that 1 second, the heaviness in his chest had vanished. The gravity had let go. He felt light, as if he might simply drift off the porch and join the debris. He waited, hoping for a second act. The minutes stretched into an hour. The cold began to seep through the blanket, a numbing tide rising from his feet to his knees. His tea was a disk of ice now. The moon, a thin sliver of silver, began its ascent over the ridge of the valley, casting long, distorted shadows across the garden. He thought about the nature of a falling star. It was a misnomer, really. It wasn't a star at all, but a rock, a piece of something broken, finding its end in a blaze of friction. It was a beautiful way to go, turning into light, because you were moving too fast to stay whole. He wondered if that was what old age was supposed to be. A slow burn as one entered the thicker atmosphere of the end. His mind wandered to the garden. In the summer, it was a riot of foxgloves and delphiniums, but now it was a graveyard of stalks and mulch. He had spent his life trying to impose order on the earth, pruning and weeding, only to realize that the earth was perfectly happy to be chaotic. The stars were the same. They followed paths he could never fully comprehend, governed by laws that didn't care for human sentiment. And yet, here he was, sitting under the porch, waiting for a sign. He thought about the word star-crossed. It was usually reserved for lovers, for those whose destinies were thwarted by the heavens. But perhaps everyone was star-crossed. Perhaps we were all just crossing paths with the infinite, briefly illuminated before we vanished back into the dark. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the star, but for the waiting. There was a dignity in the wait. It was an act of faith, a refusal to believe that the world was empty just because he was alone. To wait was to acknowledge that there was something worth seeing, something that might happen if one were only patient enough to remain still. The wind picked up, rattling the dry leaves of the hydrangea bush near the steps. Elias looked at the empty space beside him on the bench. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing the cold, rough wood. He closed his eyes and imagined Martha's hand there, her skin like warm silk, her thumb tracing the line of his knuckles. "I'm still here, Martha," he murmured. The sky remained silent. The stars did not sing, at least not in a way his human ears could detect. But as he sat there, his chin sinking toward his chest, he felt a strange, quiet hum vibrating in the air. It might have been the wind in the chimneys, or the distant drone of a car on the A6187, or perhaps it was exactly what she had told him to listen for. He stayed on the porch until the constellations had shifted their positions, until the Great Bear had turned its slow, ponderous circle around the pole star. He stayed until the cold was no longer an intruder, but a part of him, a crystalline coat of mail. He didn't see another falling star that night, but as he finally stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs, he looked up one last time. The sky was crowded, a shimmering, tessellated dome of light. It was enough. The sheer, terrifying abundance of it was enough to carry him through the dark hallway of the house, past the ticking clocks, and into the cold sheets of his bed. He walked inside, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the quiet rooms. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need them. The afterimage of the stars was burned into his retinas, a map of fire to guide him through the sleep to come. Outside, the porch sat empty. The frost began to bloom on the wood, a delicate, ephemeral lace. And high above, far beyond the reach of the wind, or the smell of the moors, the universe continued its vast, silent collapse, throwing sparks into the void for no one and everyone to see. Elias Thorne lay in the dark, his breath evening out, his heart finding its rhythm with the clocks. He thought of the streak of light he had seen, that one perfect scratch of white. It hadn't been a message, he realized. It had been an invitation to remember that even in the deepest winter, even in the most profound loneliness, the world was still capable of grace. He closed his eyes, and in the theater of his mind, he was back on the mattress in 1994, the air warm, the sky falling, and a hand holding his own. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was there. The star had landed, and for a moment, the dark was entirely, beautifully gone. The morning did not arrive with a fanfare of gold, but rather as a bruised grey seepage through the heavy velvet curtains of the master bedroom. Elias lay motionless, his body a topographical map of aches and stiffened sinew, pinned to the mattress by the sheer gravity of the silence. In that fragile state between slumber and the full weight of consciousness, he could still feel the phantom heat of Martha's shoulder against his ribs. It was a cruel trick of the nerves, a cellular memory that refused to acknowledge the ledger of the years. He remained still, barely breathing, trying to prolong the delusion that if he did not move, the ghost of 1994 might coalesce into the solidity of the present. Eventually, the grandfather clock in the hallway, a mahogany sentinel that had survived 3 generations of Thorne, struck 7. The sound was a dull thud against the quiet, a reminder that time was a relentless creditor. Elias exhaled, a long, thin plume of white in the unheated air of the room. He pushed back the duvet, the fabric rasping against his skin like dried husks, and sat up. The house, Stonecroft, felt particularly cavernous today, its stone walls exhaling the damp chill of the Edale Valley. He dressed with the slow, methodical precision of a man who had nothing but time and a deep-seated fear of chaos. Cardigan, woolen trousers, thick socks knitted by a woman whose hands were now part of the earth beneath the yew trees at St. Mary's. Every button was a small victory over the encroaching entropy. As he descended the stairs, his hand slid down the banister, finding the familiar divot in the wood where Martha used to catch her ring. He didn't just touch it, he anchored himself to it. In the kitchen, the ritual of the kettle provided a temporary scaffolding for his mind. He watched the blue ring of the gas hob, a miniature crown of fire, and thought about the invitation he had felt on the porch. Invitations usually required a response, a movement toward an entrance. But where was he supposed to go? He was 78 years old. His world had shrunk to the diameter of this house, and the narrow, winding ribbon of the A6187 that led to the village. He poured the water over the tea leaves, watching them unfurl and dance in the porcelain pot. Grace, he whispered to the steam. You said the world was capable of grace. He was speaking to the empty chair by the window, the one where the sunlight, when it bothered to appear, would catch the silver in Martha's hair. He remembered her obsession with the word. She had been a weaver by trade, her fingers always stained with vegetable dyes. Madder root, woad, well done. She saw grace as the tension in the loom. It wasn't something that just happened, it was something held in place by effort and balance. His reflections were interrupted by the sharp, rhythmic clatter of the letterbox. It was a violent sound in the stillness of Stonecroft. Elias frowned. The postman, a young man named Callum, who wore shorts even in the depths of November, rarely had anything for him other than utility bills, or the occasional catalogue for gardening tools he no longer had the strength to use. He walked to the front door, his slippers shuffling over the linoleum. There, lying on the mat like a fallen leaf, was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was hand-addressed in a script that was unfamiliar, yet strangely resonant. Sharp, angular letters that seemed to lean into the wind. Elias picked it up. The paper was heavy, expensive, smelling faintly of cedar wood and something metallic, like the air before a thunderstorm. There was no return address. He took it back to the kitchen, setting it down next to his tea. He didn't open it immediately. He was a man who savored the anticipation of a thing, knowing that the reality was often a diminished version of the possibility. He watched the steam rise and fall. He looked out at the garden, at the skeletal remains of the hydrangea bush, now silvered with a delicate rime of frost. The sky was a flat, unyielding parchment, hiding the stars he had worshipped the night before. When he finally took the silver letter opener, a wedding gift from a distant aunt, and set the envelope, his heart gave a small, erratic thump. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photograph was old, the edges curled and sepia-toned. It showed a younger version of himself, perhaps in his late 20s, standing on a hillside he recognized instantly as Mamtor. He was laughing, his hair windswept, his arm around a man he hadn't thought of in 4 decades. Julian Vance, with his sharp cheekbones and eyes that always seemed to be looking at something just beyond the horizon. Elias felt a sudden, sharp constriction in his chest. It was a physical blow, a haunting from a life he had neatly folded away and tucked into the dark corners of his memory. They were the star-crossed ones, he realized with a jolt of bitter irony, not because of tragedy, but because of the terrifying, unmapped terrain of who they were in a time that had no language for them. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same angular hand, were 4 words. The stars are falling. Elias looked at the letter. It wasn't a letter at all, but a map, a hand-drawn sketch of the moorlands, marked with precise coordinates and a date, tomorrow. His mind raced, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of old bones. Julian. The name tasted like copper and old wood smoke. They had been students together in Sheffield, 2 boys drunk on poetry and the wild, desolate beauty of the peaks. They had spent nights lying in the heather, naming constellations and whispering secrets that felt like treason against the world they had been born into. And then, the silence had come, not a sudden break, but a slow erosion, a drifting apart as the gravity of normal life, of Martha, of the shop, of the expectations of the valley had pulled Elias back to earth. Why now? Why, after 40 years of silence, would a ghost reach out from the dark? He looked at the map again. The coordinates pointed to a specific outcrop on the Great Ridge, a place they used to call the Cusp. It was a steep climb, one that his knees protested just thinking about. But as he stared at the inclines, he felt a strange, magnetic pull. The invitation of the falling star hadn't been for his memory of Martha. It had been a harbinger. He stood up, his tea forgotten and cold. He felt a sudden, desperate need to see his own face in the mirror. He walked to the hallway and stared at the man looking back. The skin was translucent, mapped with the fine blue lines of age, the eyes clouded with the cataracts of time. He looked like a man who had been waiting for the end. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of something else, a spark of the boy who had once believed he could catch the light of a dead star in his bare hands. He thought of Martha. She would have told him to go. She had always known about the rooms in his heart that he kept locked, the ones where the air was still thick with the scent of Julian's tobacco and the echoes of a different kind of love. She had never asked, and he had never offered, but in the quiet of their long marriage, there had been an unspoken greater permission to be more than just the roles they played for the world. "I'm still here, Martha," he said again, but this time the words felt different. They weren't a plea for her presence. They were an affirmation of his own. He spent the rest of the morning in a state of quiet, focused industry. He found his old hiking boots in the mudroom, the leather cracked and stiff. He spent an hour rubbing neatsfoot oil into them, the rhythmic motion soothing the tremor in his hands. He packed a small rucksack, a thermos of hot bovril, a woolen blanket, a torch, and the photograph. As he worked, the house seemed to watch him with 1,000 glass eyes. The ticking of the clocks felt less like a countdown and more like a heartbeat. He was moving. He was preparing. He was answering the call. In the late afternoon, the clouds finally broke, revealing a sliver of pale, wintry blue. Elias walked out onto the porch. The air was biting, a whetstone against his lungs, but he welcomed it. He looked up at the ridge, the dark silhouette of the hills, rising like the spine of a sleeping beast against the sky. Tomorrow, he would climb. He didn't know if Julian would be there, or if it was a cruel joke, or perhaps a message from a daughter or a son he never knew existed. It didn't matter. The map was a bridge, and for the first time in years, Elias Thorne was willing to cross it. He thought about the friction of the star, the way it turned into light, because it was moving too fast to stay whole. He realized then that he had spent too long trying to stay whole, trying to preserve himself in the amber of his grief. Perhaps the point of life wasn't to survive the atmosphere, but to burn brightly as you pass through it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, violet shadows across the frost-covered garden, Elias felt a sense of purpose that was almost terrifying. He wasn't just a piece of something broken. He was a man with a destination. He went back inside, leaving the door unlocked for the first time in a decade. He didn't need the security of bolts and chains tonight. He was already gone, his spirit already halfway up the ridge, searching for the place where the earth met the infinite, waiting for the sky to fall once more. The dawn was a bruised smear of violet and slate across the horizon when Elias finally stepped over the threshold. He did not lock the door. The iron key, heavy and cold as a dead man's coin, remained on the sideboard next to a bowl of withered potpourri. It was an act of quiet heresy, a relinquishing of the fortress he had spent for decades fortifying. The air outside was a physical weight, damp with the exhaled moisture of the valley and the sharp, metallic tang of impending frost. He began the ascent with a rhythmic, punishing slowness. Every step was a negotiation between his will and the calcified architecture of his joints. The path up from the village of Edalunda Hill was a ribbon of grey grit and shale, winding through the skeletal remains of winter gorse. He felt the cold seep through his heavy woolen jumper, settling into the marrow of his ribs, yet his chest burned with a heat that was entirely internal. It was the friction of the star against the combustion of a man who had finally stopped trying to be a monument and had decided, however late, to be a projectile. Julian had once told him that the hills were not land at all, but frozen waves of a terrestrial sea. "We're just flotsam, Elias," he had whispered, his breath smelling of hand-rolled shag and the sweet, dark stout of the nag's head, caught in the swell, waiting for the tide to pull us under. Elias stopped to catch his breath at the gate where the pasture gave way to the open moor. His heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, hammering against his sternum. He looked back down at the valley. The village was a cluster of stone matchboxes, the smoke from its chimneys rising in straight, fragile lines. Somewhere down there, in the churchyard of St. Mary's, Martha lay beneath a headstone of Derbyshire gritstone. He wondered if she could see him now, a solitary, trembling speck on the flank of the ridge. He hoped she wasn't disappointed. He hoped she understood that this journey wasn't a betrayal of their quiet, comfortable years, but the final, necessary payment of a debt he had deferred for a lifetime. The coordinates led him higher, past the wine-stunted hawthorns and the deep, peat-black hags that swallowed the light. The silence here was different from the silence of his house. The house's silence was heavy with the absence of sound, a vacuum filled with the dust of things unsaid. The silence of the great ridge was alive, a vast, humming presence composed of the wind's friction against the grass and the ancient, tectonic patience of the rock. As he neared the outcrop they called the cusp, the terrain flattened into a narrow spine. To his left, the land fell away into the dark bowl of the Vale of Castleton. To his right, the wild, undulating emptiness of the dark peak. He felt a sudden, dizzying vertigo, as if the earth were tilting on its axis. He pressed his hand against a lichen-crusted boulder to steady himself. The stone was rough, biting into his palm, a grounding reality in a world that felt increasingly ephemeral. He saw it, then the glint of something that wasn't stone or sky, near the very edge of the ridge, where the wind whipped with a predatory ferocity, sat a small, portable stove and a rucksack that looked far too modern for a man who had disappeared 40 years ago. Beside them, wrapped in a heavy parka that seemed to swallow his frame, sat a man. Elias stopped. His legs felt like water. The distance between them was only 20 yards, yet it felt like a gulf of centuries. The man didn't turn around, but he raised a hand, a slow, tentative gesture that cut through the morning mist. "You're late, Thorne," the voice said. It was a voice that had been sandpapered by time and distance, stripped of its youthful arrogance. But the cadence was unmistakable. It was the sound of a cello played in a room with no furniture. It was the sound of the secret rooms in Elias's heart finally swinging open. Elias moved forward, his boots crunching on the frost-drenched heather, his vision blurred, the landscape dissolving into a smear of grey and gold. He wasn't sure if it was the cataracts or the tears. He reached the man and stood over him, looking down at a face that was a cartography of a life lived in far-flung, sun-scorched places. The Julian he remembered was a creature of shadow and moonlight, all sharp angles and restless energy. This Julian was a creature of the earth-weathered, silver-haired, and profoundly tired. "The star fell," Elias managed to say, his voice cracking like dry timber. Julian looked up, and for a moment, the decades vanished. His eyes were still that startling, impossible blue, the color of the sky just before the first light of day. "It did. I thought you might have stopped looking at the sky." "I never stopped," Elias whispered, sinking onto the cold ground beside him. He didn't care about the damp or the cold. He only cared about the proximity of this ghost, the warmth radiating from a body he had long ago consigned to the realm of myth. Julian reached into his rucksack and pulled out a thermos, pouring a stream of dark, fragrant tea into a plastic cup. He handed it to Elias. Their fingers brushed the briefest contact and Elias felt a jolt that nearly unseated his soul. It was the touch of the living, the terrible, beautiful weight of being seen. "I went to the Andes," Julian said softly, staring out over the ridge. "Then the Himalayas. I spent 30 years chasing the high places, Elias, trying to find a sky big enough to drown out the silence I left behind in this valley." "Why did you leave?" Elias asked. It was the question that had fermented in his gut for half a lifetime, turning into a bitter, acidic thing. Julian turned his head, his gaze heavy with a sorrow that needed no explanation. Because I was a coward. I thought if I stayed, the gravity of this place would crush us both. I thought the only way to keep the light was to run toward it. He paused, his breath hitching. I didn't realize that the light was only there because you were standing in it with me. They sat in silence for a long time, two old men perched on the spine of the world, watching the sun finally heave itself over the horizon. The light flooded the valley, turning the frost to diamonds and the mist to gold. It was a baptism of fire, a cleansing of the long, dark night. Elias felt a strange lightness spreading through his limbs. The pain in his knees had faded into a dull, manageable hum. He thought of the map in his pocket, the inclines that had led him here. It wasn't a bridge back to the past, he realized. It was a bridge to the end. I thought you were dead, Elias said. In a way, I was, Julian replied. He reached out and took Elias's hand, his grip surprisingly strong, the skin like parchment. But then I saw the forecast, the meteor shower, and I remembered the night in the heather, when we promised to be here for the next one. I didn't think I'd make it. I didn't think you'd come. I had to, Elias said, closing his eyes against the brilliance of the sun. The friction, Julian. I couldn't stay whole anymore. As the morning broadened into a cold, clear brilliance, the two men sat huddled together under the vast, indifferent sky. They were to sparks in the cooling embers of a century, burning with a quiet, desperate intensity. Below them, the world went on. The shops opened, the cattle moved across the fields, the clocks ticked in the empty house in the village. But up here, on the cusp, time had ceased to be a linear thing. It was a circle, a completion, a falling star that had finally found its way home to the dark, waiting earth. The silence that followed Julian's confession was not an absence of sound, but a vast, vibrating presence, like the hum of a cathedral after the organ has ceased its breath. Elias looked down at their joined hands to landscapes of translucent skin and roped veins, intertwined like the roots of ancient hawthorns. The tea in the plastic cup sent a thin, ghostly wisp of steam into the biting air of the cusp, a small defiance against the encroaching frost. For 70 years, Elias had carried a version of Julian in his mind that was preserved in amber, a boy of 19 with soot-smudged cheeks and a laugh that tasted of summer rain. To see him now, a man of 80-something winters, was to witness the slow, indifferent erosion of time, the way the sea eventually claims the cliff. Yet, in the pressure of Julian's thumb against his knuckle, Elias felt a bridge forming over the abyss of the missing decades. He thought of the cottage in Blackwood Edge, the small, stone-walled life he had cultivated while Julian was scaling the spines of the world. He had spent his years measuring the growth of moss on the north side of the barn, watching the light shift across the valley floor, and waiting for a ghost to come home. He had been the anchor, heavy and rusted, while Julian had been the sail, tattered by gales he could barely imagine. There was a sudden, sharp pang in his chest, not of resentment, but of a profound, shattering empathy. Julian had fled to the Andes to escape the weight of a love that felt like a burial, only to find that the thin air of the peaks offered no sanctuary from the heart's persistent rhythm. You look for the light in the high places, Elias murmured, his eyes tracking a kestrel. It hung suspended on a thermal, a dark cross against the pale gold of the morning. But light is a fickle thing, Julian. It's the shadows that tell you where the ground is. Julian let out a ragged breath, a sound that seemed to catch on the jagged edges of his lungs. I spent so long trying to be untethered. I thought if I didn't touch the earth, I couldn't be broken by it. But look at us. We're both broken anyway. Only you have the dignity of having stayed where you were planted. Elias turned his head, the movement slow and deliberate. The cataracts made the world look like a watercolor left out in the rain. But he could see the moisture in Julian's eyes, the way the blue had become clouded with the milky haze of age. Dignity is a cold comfort when the house is empty, Elias said softly. I didn't stay because I was brave, Julian. I stayed because I was terrified that if I moved, I'd lose the path back to that night in the heather. I lived my life as a monument to a single moment. He reached into the pocket of his heavy woolen coat and pulled out the map. It was soft as cloth now, the creases so worn they were translucent. He unfolded it with trembling fingers, laying it across their knees. The ink was faded, the names of the local tours and guilds barely legible, but the spot where they sat was marked with a faint, crimson X that Elias had drawn a lifetime ago. "I used to study this every night," Elias confessed, his internal monologue finally spilling out into the cold morning air. "I used to trace the lines and wonder which mountain you were standing on. I imagined my finger was your footstep. I thought that if I focused hard enough, I could pull you back along the grid lines, like a fish on a hook." Julian's hand moved over the map, his touch reverent. "I didn't need a map. This valley is etched into the inside of my eyelids. Every time I closed my eyes in Tibet, or Peru, or the Atlas Mountains, I saw the way the mist rolls off the cusp. I saw you, Elias. Always you, standing by the gate, looking at the stars. The sun was higher now, a pale, winter yolk spilling its tepid warmth over the fells. The valley of Garsdale was waking up below them. The distant, rhythmic clink of a milk float, the bark of a sheepdog, the chimney smoke beginning to rise in straight, grey columns. To the rest of the world, it was Tuesday. To the men on the ridge, it was the end of an epoch. Elias felt the friction. He had spoken of the grinding of his soul against the shell of a body that could no longer contain it. He felt as though he were becoming porous, the molecules of his being vibrating in sympathy with the limestone beneath him. The grief that had been a solid, heavy stone in his gut for 50 years was dissolving, turning into something light and ephemeral, like the frost melting into the heather. He realized then that he wasn't afraid of the end. The terror had always been the waiting. Now that the waiting was over, there was only the vast, shimmering present. "The stars don't really fall, do they?" Julian asked, his voice sounding smaller, more distant, as if he were already beginning to drift away. "No," Elias replied, leaning his head against Julian's shoulder. The wool of Julian's jumper smelled of cedarwood and old travel, a scent that felt like a library of lost stories. "They just burn up when they hit the atmosphere. They give everything they have just to light up the dark for a second. It's the friction that makes them beautiful." "I think I'm ready," Julian whispered, "to stop burning." Elias closed his eyes. Behind his lids, the universe was a swirling kaleidoscope of indigo and silver. He thought of his mother's kitchen, the smell of burnt toast, the way the floorboards creaked in the hall. He thought of the decades of solitude, the quiet meals, the books read by the fire, the letters never sent. All of it, the joy and the excruciating loneliness, felt like a single, indrawn breath. "Me too," Elias said. He felt Julian's grip tighten one last time, a pulse of pure, unadulterated recognition. It was the touch of the boy in the heather, the man in the Andes, the ghost in the garden. They sat there, to ancient sentinels, as the light continued to broaden, turning the world into a cathedral of glass. The map on their knees caught a gust of wind and fluttered, its edges dancing, but it stayed pinned beneath their joined hands. Elias let his breath out, a long, slow exhalation that seemed to merge with the mountain air. He felt the weight of his years slipping away, the aches in his joints vanishing into the cold. He was no longer the man who waited. He was the arrival itself. The stars had fallen, the promise had been kept, and the long, dark night had finally surrendered to the dawn. There was no more distance to bridge, no more maps to follow. Under the vast, indifferent sky, the two sparks finally guttered out, leaving behind a silence that was perfect, whole, and utterly at peace. Below them, the valley continued its slow, green life, unaware that on the spine of the world, a circle had finally been closed, and two wandering souls had found their way home to the earth.